I've had about a 40-year run of fascination with the Amityville Horror. I saw the movie before I read the book, and so I didn't really think too much at the time about the validity to the actual events as they were portrayed in the film. The taglines, "For God's sakes, get out," and "based on a chilling true story," meant very little to me at the time, and most 12-year-olds wouldn't strive for that level of content analysis anyways. We just saw a haunted house with windows that looked like evil eyes, and a father who wanted to solve life's problems with his axe. I went into the movie thinking that it was just going to be a haunted house version of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. I'm not going to critique the movie except to say that it was one of the most amazing examples of slow-burning acting I've ever seen in my life. The book is a different scene altogether and does a better job at deep diving into the events. And not to spoil anything, but in the book, the father only uses his axe for actual wood chopping. There is a nun that does come to visit that checks out pretty fast when she senses the demons gurgling from the basement, and the book version does spare us of her amazing vomiting abilities. I'm not going to critique the book either, though far superior as it is to the movie. What I want is to discuss whether or not I think the Lutzes were totally full of shit and made the entire story up, or did something actually happen and they simply didn't understand it and were swayed by people who thought it would make a good cash grab. Maybe a few events took place. Some could easily be debunked. So let's break this down, the activity they claimed was happening. I'm only going to point out a few of the major events of the story from both the book and movie and ignore any subplots where the claims were absolutely preposterous on its face. First up, the blessing of the house. Their friend the priest shows up towards the end of the moving day to bless the house. He completes his tasks and doesn't seem to want to stick around too long for chit-chat and refuses an invitation to stay for dinner. 18 months later, while interviewing him for the book, the priest recounts to the author that he heard a voice say with terrible clarity, "Get out." The movie does a good job of recreating this actually, and the voice freaked me out when I first heard it. Get out! So why did he not bother to say anything about this at the time? During subsequent conversations with George on the phone, he makes no mention of this until, of course, the book interview, by which time the house and story had gained considerable notoriety in the local press. I consider this an induced false memory through suggestion. Paranormal stories in the 70s had a standard degree of religious tones woven into them, such as The Exorcist and The Omen. It was a style of the times, and during the outline phase of the novel, the Lutzes made mention of the priest blessing their house, but from their point of view, nothing happened after his visit except to say that he came down with the flu. And they didn't see him too much after that. Too juicy to just let it fall wayside, and so I'm sure the author, in his convincing ways, surmised that the good father, during his holy chore, had in fact heard an angry, disembodied voice directed solely at him. Next, flies in a certain room at the wrong time of year. Textbook debunking that a paranormal investigator would probably not spend a whole lot of time worrying about. An old house that stood virtually abandoned for the better part of a year. By all accounts, much of the furniture that wasn't splattered with blood and brain matter were left as is and included in the purchase price of the house. The place was probably filthy, garbage could have been left behind in the room where the flies were discovered. And as the weather almanac reveals, the temperature range of the South Shore on December 18th, 1975 was hovering in the 39 Fahrenheit range. And while not entirely conducive to the survival of flies as such, it would not be entirely out of the question to see them in action. Questions like that often come up in home improvement discussion forums more than paranormal ones. Then there's the case of the missing money. Kathy's brother Jimmy, on the day of his wedding, was wagging around a thick wad of money which was due the caterer that evening. Wagging it around in front of a man whose own financial collapse was so imminent that I'm sure every time he saw a dollar bill that didn't belong to him, the network of crow's foot wrinkles that hammocked his sunken bloodshot eyes would grow at least another 2 inches. George might not have been a thief as such, but I'm sure his desperation overwhelmed his moral judgment, resulting in brother Jimmy being relieved of his cash the moment his back was turned. It's not uncommon, though, for items to suddenly vanish in a haunted environment, but given all the inconsistencies in their story, coupled with their financial embarrassment, I'd be leaning more thieving humans than thieving spirits. If truth be told, they weren't driven from the house. They did a midnight move when it became apparent that they wouldn't even be able to make their first mortgage payment. In the end, he had no choice but to hand the mortgage back to the bank, sell off his family's stake in their company, pay off his debts, and try to start over. Anyway, enough blasting poor George about money. He was only 28 at the time and probably not too terribly bright. Let's examine a few other events before I present my closing statement. 65% of children under the age of 10 will have, at some point, an imaginary friend. My kids had them. Our friends' kids had them. They don't seem to last too long. They're manufactured for varying reasons: social stress, home stress, loneliness, overactive imaginations, or maybe they think their friends are all morons. Little 5-year-old Missy would certainly have every reason to create hers. That's a lot of home stress to cram into such a short life. Mom divorces her real dad, then shacks up with another guy who, by all accounts, is not the most patient man in the world when it comes to kids. Ripped out of the comfort of her home and moved into a large house where a whole family was murdered. So, big shock, she started conversing with her rocking chair. But of course, that would make for dry reading and a ghost story. No harm at all in putting a few extra trimmings on that turkey for readership's sake. Lastly, the being that George encounters on their final night, I'm dismissing that as out-and-out sensationalized bullshit. As I said at the top, the story has fascinated me for over 40 years. There's so many documentaries and analysis videos that it's tough to keep up with them. George and Kathy never once deviated from their version of what happened, and I really believe that they believe it. The reality of it is, they bought a house they could not afford, used the bumps and knocks an old house makes as the basis for a story. As so frequently reported, it was devised over several bottles of wine, with the defense attorney of the guy convicted of killing his family a year earlier in the house. And finally, finding a willing outlet for the story in an author who wanted to, as he put it, write something that would enable him to retire to some tropical locale. All the pieces fit. We just needed everyone to stick to their stories. A huge risk indeed, and in some ways, it did pay off. The end creation? The all-American suburban ghost story played out by an all-American nuclear family, and has now fully ingrained itself in pop culture. So, well done in that regard, I have to say. I'm actually quite impressed. But as a one-man jury, it wasn't my mission to judge how big the legend became. It was my mission to determine if I think they were honest or the world's greatest bullshit artists. The verdict is, probably a bit of both. I think at most they may have experienced some mid-level residual activities owed to the tragic events that imprinted itself in the environment. The Warrens' subsequent investigations of the house did seem to support the Lutz's claim that the place reeked of evil, but then every single occupant that lived there afterwards reported not only no ghosts, but not even the odd bump in the night. And Jimmy's money, as of this writing, is still missing. So who are we to believe? As far as great ghost stories go, I still think it stands as one of the best, and as hypocritical as it may sound, if I ever got the chance to investigate this place, I would do it in the drop of a hat. Not for fame or notoriety. Well, maybe for the cash in. Why should George be the only one to yank that lever and have 3 cherries pop up? But really more to simply see for myself what all the fuss was about. For all we know, Jody the pig might be real and waiting in an eternal limbo in some dark corner of that house, waiting for someone to talk to.
Waiting for you.